April 29th, 1945, 11:45 hours. RAF Lancaster bomber over western Netherlands. Flight Lieutenant Robert Davies flew at 400 feet dangerously low, impossibly vulnerable, over German-occupied Holland. His Lancaster bomber, which had spent 3 years dropping explosives on Nazi Germany, now carried something different in its bomb bay: sacks of flour, canned meat, chocolate, dried milk, 7 tons of food instead of 7 tons of bombs. Below, in the streets of The Hague, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, thousands of Dutch civilians stood watching, waving. They were starving, victims of the Hongerwinter, the Hongerwinter of 1944-45, that had killed over 20,000 people and left hundreds of thousands more on the edge of death. Robert's crew could see them clearly at this altitude: skeletal figures in ragged clothes, children with distended bellies, elderly collapsed against buildings, people too weak to do more than wave. The Dutch had been eating tulip bulbs, sugar beets, anything remotely edible. Now British bombers were coming to save them, with German permission, in one of the war's strangest truces. "Bomb bay open," Robert's bombardier announced, releasing cargo in 3, 2. The Lancaster lurched upward as 7 tons of food dropped from its belly. White parachutes blossomed, makeshift chutes sewn from damaged bomber parachutes, each carrying sacks of food toward the starving population below. The food packages drifted down over Duindicht Racecourse, designated drop zone, where Dutch volunteers waited to collect and distribute supplies. Robert circled once, low enough to see people rushing toward the landing food, and felt tears on his face. For 3 years, he'd brought death to Europe. Today, for the first time, he brought life. Behind him, 240 more Lancaster and Mosquito bombers followed in the largest humanitarian airlift in history. Operation Manna had begun. 10 days of mercy flights that would save hundreds of thousands of Dutch lives and create bonds between Britain, America, and the Netherlands lasting generations. The Hongerwinter, the context of catastrophe. The Dutch famine of 1944-45, the Hongerwinter, was deliberate German policy, brutal winter weather, and military stalemate combined into humanitarian catastrophe. In September 1944, the Dutch government in exile called for railway strikes to support Allied advances following D-Day. Dutch railway workers complied, paralyzing transportation across German-occupied Netherlands. The German response was savage. Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart imposed total embargo on food transport to western Netherlands, Holland's most populated region, including Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, Utrecht, Leiden. The timing was catastrophic. Winter 1944-45 was the coldest in decades. Temperatures plunged below freezing for weeks. Rivers and canals froze solid, preventing what little transport remained. The war's final months saw Allied bombing and German flooding defensive measures, destroying infrastructure further. Western Netherlands held 4.5 million people dependent on food imports. The embargo cut off supplies completely. Official rations fell from barely adequate 1,400 calories daily, October 1944 to 580 calories, February 1945 to sometimes under 400 calories, by April 1945, slow starvation rations. The mathematics of hunger were brutal and precise. Normal adult requires approximately 2,000 calories daily. Hard labor requires 3,000 plus calories. Under 1,200 calories, body begins consuming itself. Under 800 calories, organ damage begins. Under 500 calories, death approaches within weeks. By winter's end, official rations provided 1/5 of minimum survival needs. Actual food availability was worse. Official rations often unavailable, requiring desperate foraging. The population adapted through increasingly desperate measures: eating tulip bulbs, toxic but slightly nutritious when prepared correctly; consuming sugar beet pulp, animal feed, barely digestible; stripping bark from trees; catching rats and pigeons; eating anything organic that wouldn't immediately kill. People traveled hundreds of miles on foot to rural areas, trading family heirlooms for potatoes or bread. Hunger trips, trekking to farms, bartering watches, jewelry, furniture for food, became desperate necessity. Many died during these journeys, collapsing from exhaustion on roads. The death toll mounted systematically. October 1944. Hunger begins affecting vulnerable populations. December 1944. Deaths increasing, especially elderly and children. January-March 1945. Mass starvation. Approximately 1,000 deaths weekly. Total deaths. Estimates range 18,000 to 22,000, with consensus around 20,000. Near deaths. Hundreds of thousands suffered permanent health damage. The horror was visible. People with edema swelling from protein deficiency, children with distended bellies, kwashiorkor malnutrition, adults unable to walk from weakness, bodies in streets collected by special carts, mass graves, societal breakdown. By April 1945, Western Netherlands was dying. Without intervention, hundreds of thousands would die before war's end. The situation demanded action transcending normal military operations, something unprecedented, dangerous, and desperately necessary. The negotiation, enemy permissions. The proposal seemed impossible. Fly Allied bombers over German-occupied territory, at low altitude, making them vulnerable, dropping food instead of bombs, with German permission and cooperation. But in late April 1945, several factors made the impossible negotiable. Military reality. Germany was finished. Soviet forces surrounded Berlin. Western allies controlled Western Germany. Defeat was days or weeks away. Some German commanders recognized continued fighting was pointless murder. Humanitarian crisis. The famine was visible catastrophe. International Red Cross and Swedish government pressured all parties. Even some German officials recognized that 4.5 million Dutch starving to death would be one atrocity too many. Dutch resistance contact. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands maintained communication channels with both allies and certain German officials. Negotiations occurred through multiple intermediaries. German self-interest. Reichskommissar Seyss-Inquart, later tried and executed for war crimes, saw food relief as possibly mitigating his guilt. Some German commanders hoped cooperation might earn lenient post-war treatment. The negotiations were complex and fragile. Key terms. Allied bombers would fly designated routes at low altitude. Germans would not fire on relief aircraft. Drop zones would be specific locations cleared of military equipment. German forces would not interfere with food distribution. The truce was purely humanitarian. Combat elsewhere continued. The agreement was extraordinary. Sworn enemies cooperating to prevent civilian catastrophe while still fighting each other everywhere else. The Allies didn't trust German promises. Flying at 400 feet over enemy territory required faith in enemy restraint. One German officer deciding to open fire could massacre bomber crews. But desperation demanded risk. On April 29, 1945, the first Operation Manna flights launched. The first flight, April 29, 1945. Robert Davies' Lancaster was among 240 RAF bombers, Lancasters and Mosquitoes, flying the first mission. The briefing had been surreal. You'll fly at 400 feet over Holland. Germans won't shoot. You'll drop food, not bombs. If this works, we'll feed millions of starving civilians. The crews were skeptical. Germans not shooting at low-flying bombers? After years of flak and fighters, trusting enemy restraint seemed suicidal. But intelligence confirmed German agreement, and Dutch were dying. The mission proceeded. The formation flew across the Channel, descended to low altitude over German-occupied Netherlands. Robert's altimeter showed 400 feet, lower than training minimums. Altitude making bombers perfect targets for any German gunner who decided to ignore the truce. Below, the Dutch population emerged from buildings. Word had spread about the relief flights. Thousands lined streets, stood on rooftops, filled parks and squares. They waved Dutch flags forbidden under occupation, orange banners, national color bedsheets, anything visible from the air. Robert saw their faces clearly, skeletal, desperate, hopeful. Old men weeping, mothers holding children up to sea, teenagers cheering despite obvious weakness. The scale of starvation was visible from altitude, entire population emaciated, moving slowly from weakness, thousands of people who'd been days or weeks from death, now watching salvation arrive. Approaching drop zone, the navigator announced. Due indict race course, 2 minutes. The race course had been designated drop zone. Large open space, cleared of obstacles, staffed by Dutch volunteers, ready to collect and distribute food. German forces had withdrawn from the immediate area, respecting the truce. Robert opened bomb bay doors. The Lancaster's mechanics, designed for releasing explosives, now released sacks of flour, canned meat, dried milk, chocolate, 7 tons of food per bomber, 1,680 tons on this first mission. The packages tumbled out, white parachutes opening, food drifting down toward starving population. Robert circled, watching Dutch volunteers and civilians rush to collect the supplies. People were crying, cheering, collapsing in relief. Some ate immediately. Dangerous for starving people, but understandable desperation. The mission lasted several hours. 240 bombers, taking turns over multiple drop zones. Not a single German shot was fired. The truce held. Robert landed at RAF Downham Market, feeling exhausted but transformed. For 3 years I've killed, he told his crew. Today for the first time I saved lives. I'll remember this mission when I've forgotten all the others. Operation Manna, the RAF campaign. The success of April 29th enabled continuation. Over the next 10 days, April 29th, May 8th, 1945, RAF conducted Operation Manna with increasing scale and efficiency. The statistics told the story. Missions flown 11 days, including German surrender on May 5th, after which missions continued. Bombers participating, 3,000 sorties. Food delivered approximately 0 tons. Drop zones, 8 locations across western Netherlands. Casualties, 0. No aircraft lost. Despite vulnerability, the operation scale was massive. Every available bomber diverted from combat operations participated. Ground crews worked overnight loading food instead of bombs. Each mission involved hundreds of aircraft following precise routes, dropping at designated zones, returning for next load. The food came from multiple sources. British military rations, diverted from combat units. Canadian supplies. Canada had large Dutch expatriate community. Donated heavily. Emergency food stocks from UK reserves. Donations from Commonwealth nations. The contents were carefully selected. Flour, calorie-dense, long-lasting, usable for bread. Canned meat, protein, immediately edible. Dried milk, crucial for children. Chocolate, high calories, immediately edible, morale boost. Cigarettes, not nutritious, but valuable for barter and morale. Margarine, fats, essential for malnutrition recovery. Each drop zone had Dutch volunteer organization collecting and distributing supplies. The distribution system was remarkably efficient. Food reached population within hours, prioritizing most vulnerable children, elderly, pregnant women, sick. The psychological impact matched the physical. Dutch civilians seeing RAF bombers, which had spent years bombing Germany, now saving Dutch lives, created powerful emotional response. British and Dutch had been allies, but this was alliance demonstrated through sacrifice, pilots risking lives and mercy, feeding former civilians of neutral then occupied nation. Operation Chowhound, the American contribution. The Americans launched parallel Operation Chowhound, running May 1st, date 1945, using B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers. The American effort statistics. Missions, 8 days. Sorties, 2,268 B-17 bomber flights. Food delivered approximately 4,000 tons. Aircraft. U.S. 8th Air Force heavy bombers diverted from combat. Methods. Similar low-altitude drops over designated zones. The American B-17s, even larger than Lancasters, carried more food per sortie. The combined Anglo-American effort delivered over 10,000 tons of food to starving Netherlands in 10 days, enough to prevent mass deaths, until ground relief could arrive after German surrender. Captain William Harrison flew B-17 SAS on Chowhound missions. His experience paralleled Robert Davies's. We'd bombed Germany for 2 years. We'd lost friends to flak and fighters, then suddenly we're flying at 400 feet over Holland, dropping food instead of bombs, and Dutch civilians are crying and waving. It was the most meaningful mission we ever flew. Guys who'd never shown emotion were weeping, seeing those starving people finally getting help. The Americans faced same risks as British, total vulnerability to German fire if truce failed. But like RAF, not a single USAAF aircraft was lost to enemy action during Chowhound. The truce held perfectly, one of war's strangest moments of cooperation. The Dutch response. For starving Dutch civilians, the relief flights were miracles visible in the sky. Anna de Vries, age 14 in April 1945, living in Rotterdam, remembered the first mission. We heard aircraft approaching, hundreds of them, so low we could see pilots' faces. We'd hidden during bombing raids for years, but these planes weren't attacking. They were dropping parachutes with food. Food. People were screaming, crying, running toward the drop zones. My mother collapsed, just sat in the street, weeping. We'd been eating tulip bulbs. We'd buried neighbors who starved, and now British were feeding us. The emotional response was overwhelming. Dutch civilians stood in streets for hours, watching mission after mission, waving flags, singing Dutch national anthem, crying. Elderly people who'd survived occupation and starvation wept, seeing salvation arrive. Children who'd forgotten what full stomachs felt like danced in streets. The gratitude was profound and immediate. Dutch painted thank you messages on rooftops in English. People arranged tulips and flowers spelling thanks. Buildings displayed British and American flags alongside Dutch. Civilians wrote thousands of letters to RAF and USAAF, thanking crews. Post-war, Dutch erected monuments to Operation Manna. Chowhound. Peter van Dijk, doctor in Amsterdam, treated malnutrition victims. Before Manna, I was watching people die daily from starvation. I had no food to give them, no medicine to treat malnutrition. I documented deaths, knowing more would die tomorrow. Then the food arrived. Within days, death rates dropped dramatically. Within weeks, I saw people recovering who'd been near death. Those pilots saved hundreds of thousands of lives. I'll be grateful until I die. The food distribution was relatively orderly, despite desperation. Dutch resistance members and volunteers organized collection points, prioritized vulnerable populations, prevented hoarding. The system worked because Dutch knew collective cooperation was only chance of survival. Chaos would waste precious food. The risks? What could have gone wrong? The operation's success obscures how dangerous they were. Multiple factors could have turned mercy missions into massacres. German treachery. Any German officer could have ordered fire on defenseless bombers. At 400 feet, bombers were perfect targets. One flak battery could have killed entire crew in seconds. The truce depended on German honor when Germans had committed atrocities across Europe. Accidents. Low-altitude flying was inherently dangerous. 400 feet left, minimal margin for error. Mechanical failure, pilot error, or weather could cause crashes. Birds could damage engines. Flying in formation at low altitude multiplied collision risks. Navigation errors. Dropping food outside designated zones could hit civilians, cause chaos, invalidate truce. Precision navigation at low altitude over unfamiliar territory was challenging. German military changes. Field commanders might not receive truce orders. Troops might fire instinctively. Communication failures could prove fatal. That 0 aircraft were lost to enemy action across 500-plus sorties was extraordinary. The risk was real. Crews wrote final letters before missions, recognizing they might not return. They flew anyway because Dutch were dying and saving them justified risk. Flight Lieutenant Davies described the fear. Flying at 400 feet over enemy territory felt insane. Every instinct screamed, this was suicide. We were completely vulnerable. One German gunner having bad day could kill us all, but we'd seen those starving people. We couldn't not go. So we flew, trusted the truce would hold, and dropped food knowing we might die doing it. That's why it mattered so much. We risked everything to save people who weren't even our civilians. The aftermath. Liberation and recovery. Germany surrendered May 8, 1945, May 5 in Netherlands. Allied ground forces immediately entered Western Netherlands, bringing massive food aid, medical supplies, infrastructure repair. But Manna's Schauhound had already saved the population. Medical assessments showed death rate declined dramatically after relief flights. Malnutrition cases stabilized, then improved. Psychological impact was immediate, hope returning. Food bridge prevented mass deaths during final weeks. The post-war recovery was lengthy. Malnutrition effects lasted years, stunted growth in children, permanent health damage in adults, psychological trauma from months of starvation. But hundreds of thousands who would have died survived because of the mercy flights. The Dutch-British-American bonds formed during Manna Schauhound lasted generations. Annual commemoration ceremonies. Monuments at drop zones. Veterans invited to Netherlands for reunions. Dutch school children learning about operations as pivotal moment. Post-war Dutch-British friendship, partly rooted in memory of mercy. Robert Davies returned to Netherlands in 1985 for 40th anniversary. Dutch veterans of the Hongerwinter, now elderly, met the now elderly RAF crews. The reunion was emotional. Survivors thanking the pilots who saved them. Pilots meeting people they'd saved as children. Anna de Vries, age 54 in 1985, met Robert. I was 14, starving, watching my family die. You flew over and dropped food. You saved us. I had children because you saved me. My grandchildren exist because you risked your life. How do you thank someone for that? Robert's response. We were just doing what needed doing. You would have done the same. The moral complexity. Mercy during total war. Operation Manna Schauhound created moral questions with no simple answers. Question 1. Helping enemy civilians. The Dutch were under German occupation, but they weren't combatants. Yet Allied resources used to feed them could have supported combat operations. Every bomber on mercy mission wasn't bombing Germany. Was this justified trade-off? Answer. The Dutch had resisted occupation, aided Allied pilots, provided intelligence. They were allies under enemy control. Feeding them was moral imperative and strategic necessity, preventing Soviet influence in post-war Netherlands, ensuring stable ally. Question 2. Trusting German promises. The truce required trusting promises from regime that had committed Holocaust, broken treaties, executed POWs, was risking bomber crews on German word justified. Answer. The gamble worked. Not a single aircraft was lost to German fire. The truce held because even some Germans recognized pointless starvation was atrocity too far. But risk was real. Success doesn't retroactively eliminate danger. Question 3. Priorities in war's final days. With Germany nearly defeated, should resources have gone to final combat operations rather than humanitarian relief? Answer. The war was won. Final combat operations would save days or weeks. The famine was killing thousands weekly. Humanitarian need was immediate and solvable. Mercy wasn't weakness, it was strength applied where it mattered most. Question 4. German participation. Should Allies have negotiated with war criminals, like Seyss-Inquart? Did cooperation legitimize their authority? Answer. The priority was saving Dutch lives. Negotiating with criminals was distasteful but necessary. Post-war justice could address crimes. Seyss-Inquart was executed in 1946. Temporary cooperation for humanitarian purposes didn't excuse his atrocities. The operations demonstrated that even in total war, mercy remains possible. Enemies can cooperate for humanitarian purposes while still fighting militarily. Saving civilians isn't weakness, but expression of values worth fighting for. The legacy.
What Manna Schauhound taught.
The operation's significance extended far beyond immediate food relief. Military precedent. First large-scale humanitarian airlift in history. Established template for Berlin airlift. 1948-49. Modern humanitarian air operations. Disaster relief. Proved military aircraft could effectively deliver civilian aid. International law, influenced post-war Geneva Convention, revisions protecting civilians, establishing humanitarian truces during combat, requiring protection of non-combatants. Operations demonstrated that warring parties could cooperate for humanitarian purposes. Strategic insight showed mercy as strategic tool. Feeding Dutch created lasting goodwill, ensured stable democratic Netherlands, demonstrated Western values versus Soviet methods. Cold War alliances partly rooted in WWI humanitarian actions. Human dimension proved individuals could choose mercy within systematic violence. Pilots risked lives to save civilians. Ground crews loaded food instead of bombs. Commanders diverted resources from combat to humanitarian need. Individual choices created collective mercy. Symbol of hope became touchstone for Netherlands. Moment when allies proved alliance meant something. When mercy arrived literally from sky. When humanity persisted through war's worst darkness. Dutch identity partly shaped by memory of being saved when death seemed inevitable. Robert Davies, asked in 1995 about Manna's meaning, said, "We'd spent years killing. We were good at it. Destroyed cities, killed thousands, did what war demanded. But Manna was different. For 10 days we saved lives instead of taking them. We risked ourselves to feed starving people who weren't even our responsibility. That's when I understood what we'd been fighting for, not just to defeat Germany, but to preserve civilization that valued human life, showed mercy to the helpless, chose compassion when cruelty would have been easier. Every bomb I dropped was justified if it enabled those 10 days when we brought life instead of death." The final mission, May 7, 1945. The final Manna mission flew May 7, 1945, day before German surrender. Robert Davies flew his last food drop that afternoon, his Lancaster part of 145 bomber formation, making final delivery before war's end. The Netherlands below was transformed from first mission. The dying population now showed life returning. People moving with energy, children playing, work resuming. The food had saved them. The difference was visible from 400 feet. Robert's crew dropped their final load over Rotterdam, circled once, and headed home. Below, Dutch civilians spelled out massive thank you in tulips. Thousands of flowers arranged in letters visible from altitude, final message to departing bombers. "That's when I cried," Robert said later. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming recognition that we'd done something meaningful. We'd taken instruments of death, heavy bombers designed to destroy cities, and used them to save a nation. We'd proven mercy was possible, even in war's midst. Those tulips spelling thanks represented everything I'd hoped we were fighting for. The Lancaster crossed the channel, landed at Downham Market, and Robert climbed out for the last time. The war in Europe ended the next day. Of all his missions, dozens of bombing raids, cities destroyed, targets obliterated, the 10 days of Operation Manna were what he remembered most clearly, treasured most deeply, and spoke about most proudly for the rest of his life. "I was a bomber pilot," he said in his final interview, before dying in 2003, age 84. "I brought death to Europe. But for 10 days in April 1945, I brought life instead. Those were the days that made everything else worthwhile. Those were the days I was most proud to serve." The starving Dutch families who wept watching RAF bombers drop food instead of bombs taught the final lesson of World War II, that mercy matters most when it's hardest, that humanity persists even in war's worst darkness, that sometimes the greatest courage isn't killing enemies but saving them, and that the most meaningful victories aren't won through destruction, but through choosing compassion when destruction would be easier. The mercy bombers of Operation Manna saved hundreds of thousands of lives, and proved that even in total war, even flying over enemy territory, even risking everything, the choice to feed the starving instead of bombing the enemy represents the highest expression of the values civilization fights to preserve.